This is a contentious topic. I'm going to follow my usual methodology and try to equally offend everyone. So if you like what you're hearing, wait a few minutes and you'll want to throw things at me. I guarantee it. To obtain perspective, it's useful to go back to the origins of one country, two systems. In the fall of 1979, a famous Chinese general offered Taiwan the opportunity to keep its economic system, its social system, its governing system, and even its military, as long as it acknowledged that it was part of the People's Republic. Taiwan rejected that. Years later, Deng Xiaoping used the idea to resolve an emergent crisis over Hong Kong. There was a crisis because 15 years from 1992, the biggest part of Hong Kong, the new territories, was scheduled to go back to China. Investors in real estate were terrified that they would put up a lot of money for a big building and lose everything on July 1st of 1997. Those concerns led to a historic confrontation between Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping. Now, if you were looking forward to that, probably the two most unlikely people imaginable to reach an agreement were this tough iron lady from London and this tough old communist general from China. But they were both sensible, pragmatic people. And they understood that the costs of warfare would be horrendous and the benefits of peace would be enormous. Hong Kong at that time was absolutely crucial economically to China. So they reached a deal that became the 1985 Joint Declaration, which promised to preserve the judicial system, the legislative and executive autonomy of Hong Kong, and all the key freedoms. I just quote, rights and freedoms including those of the person, of speech, of the press, of assembly, of association, of travel, of movement, of correspondence, of strike, of choice of occupation, of academic research, and of religious belief, unquote. That was an international treaty registered with the United Nations that's still legally in effect. Annex 2 provided that the British and Chinese would consult to work out any matter on which there was disagreement. Deng believed that one country, two systems for Hong Kong would facilitate eventual reunification with Taiwan. He believed that by 2047, the period of autonomy goes from 1997 to 2047, that China would have come up to Taiwan's level of development, both economically and politically. And he believed that by 2047, China's sincerity about one country, two systems would be so obvious that Taiwan would find China an attractive partner. Chinese leaders were determined to make the deal work. They consulted widely. Here I'm giving Zhu Rongji a copy of my book, The Rise of China. Part of the consultations we were doing on Hong Kong. And this is Vincent Lo, the leader of the Business and Professionals Federation, which is kind of the Hong Kong Tycoons Incorporated. Originally it was called the Basic Law Drafting Committee. I served on the board and was chairman of the Economic Committee. China's leaders were very accessible. I also went and talked with them as a governor of the American Chamber of Commerce. When we wanted to talk to them, they were available. And they wanted every possible advice on how to make this Hong Kong situation work. They regarded the business tycoons as the real experts on Hong Kong. Zhu Rongji was always the most impressive. So open and confident, as tough a guy as you ever want to meet in this life, but great politician. When I gave him my book, he said, "Oh, I have a copy of this. I've read it and I keep it on the shelf beside my desk. But this one has your signature on it, so it's more valuable. I'll keep this one too." And it didn't matter whether it was true. He was a great politician. Some of his colleagues, like Li Peng, were not such great politicians. One of the things about Zhu Rongji was that he's totally in control of his own ego. He just wanted to do what was right for China. So we could criticize him, and he was fine with that. The British governor, Sir David Wilson, a lifelong China expert, was equally open and sensitive to what would work in this complex interaction among the UK, Hong Kong, and China. And that interaction ensured a very flexible, optimistic spirit. It's difficult today to convey that open, optimistic spirit. So I'll just give you one example. China had decided to turn the huge island of Hainan into a free port, and the governor had decided to make it a copy of Hong Kong. So he approached a friend of mine at RAND Corporation, the U.S. Air Force's leading think tank, where I worked subsequently, and asked Charles Wolfe, my friend, to work on a plan for turning Hainan into a new Hong Kong. And Charles called me up and asked me to write the section on whether Hainan should change from using the Chinese RMB as its currency to using the Hong Kong dollar as its currency. That was the spirit of the times. Then June 4th, 1989, intervened. The Hong Kong stock market and property market collapsed. The British felt that some kind of decisive action was necessary to restore Hong Kong's confidence, and they looked to their British business leadership for what to do. So they did two things. One was to build a gigantic airport. Those of you who've been there know it's a wonderful airport. And Hong Kong needed a new airport. And the old one, Kai Tak, you flew down and you could watch people's TVs in the windows on either side as you landed. But China offered to cede land in Shenzhen next door and a roadway to make it part of Hong Kong so that they could build an airport there at a cost of about $3 billion. The British rejected that on the internal argument that you can't trust those Chinese. And they classified the offer as top secret so that the Hong Kong people would never know about it. I believe it's still classified top secret today. Instead, they planned a $24 billion airport to be built on an island out in the South China Sea. You had to flatten the island and extend it and then build a railroad and a road out to it. The joint declaration required consultation about any decision that might involve disagreement between the parties, and there was certainly disagreement about this one. The Chinese feared that the airport could be a funnel to take funds out of Hong Kong and move them into British firms. my personal experience is that some of those fears were fully justified. The British argued that informing the Chinese was the same as consulting them. That nonsense was a clear breach of the Joint Declaration. In addition, the British business community argued that Governor Wilson, a diplomat, should be replaced by a tough political figure who could take decisive action. And as a result, they replaced the Foreign Office diplomat, Governor Wilson, with Christopher Patten. Patten didn't know much about Hong Kong or about China, but he postured himself as a plenipotentiary of the great British Empire, putting the uncivilized Chinese in their place. His tone in speaking about China was one of muted contempt. And the British are much better at that, so I won't try to imitate it. A few weeks into his tenure, he announced that he was going to reorganize Hong Kong's Legislative Council to make it more democratic. His applause line in that speech was that he had not consulted China. That was the ultimate insult to the Chinese leadership and a clear breach of the Joint Declaration. It was the definitive end of any chance for further political reform in Hong Kong. Everything stopped right there. All we could do was wait for July 1st, 1997, when the Chinese would respond to the insult by reversing everything Patten had done. In my opinion, with patience and empathy, the kinds of reforms that Patten imposed temporarily could have been achieved and extended gradually much further if someone knowledgeable and with a diplomatic temperament had been governor instead of Patten, the old diplomat on the right and Chris Patten on the left. China felt it had to respond to Patten's unilateralism, so Premier Li Peng announced that China would withhold decision about the structure of Hong Kong's Court of Final Appeal. Under the British, the final appeal was to the Privy Council in London. So they're going to keep everything the same except have a Court of Final Appeal. He's going to defer decisions until after the 1997 handover. Politically, that was understandable, but by April of 1995, the business community had a sense of crisis. Hong Kong's continued vitality depended on continuity of the legal system. In response, a group of Hong Kong Chinese tycoons, plus one non-tycoon myself, representing the Business and Professionals Federation, went to Beijing to confront Li Peng with the likelihood of an economic crash if he didn't reverse himself. The tycoons were afraid to confront the man who was known as the butcher of Tiananmen Square. So they asked me to do it. I did so rather enthusiastically, and told him that just among the people in the room, there would be investments that would not happen, and Hong Kong would suffer a severe economic downturn in the year before the handover. I said, Mr. Prime Minister, you really don't want that. Li Peng wasn't happy with me. He responded very testily. Your job as businessman is to build ports and roads and telecommunications, and my job as Prime Minister is to decide about courts. You do your job and I'll do my job. I went right on explaining why there would be an economic crisis, and he really needed to take this seriously. Eventually he got annoyed and threw us out. But the next morning, the Beijing newspaper had a column about our visit, and the headline was, "Premier calls for early decision on court of final appeal. Hong Kong's British legal system continues to thrive. No thanks to Governor Patton." Western understanding of one country, two systems in those days was informed by Western media. And those media provided probably the most irresponsible, sustained period in Western media's 20th century history. It was amazing to be part of it. The core story was the death of Hong Kong. Hong Kong was being depleted. Everybody was leaving. All the businesses were moving to Singapore. The economy of Hong Kong and southern China were a mess. Almost all newspapers in the Western world that had international news reported that 64,000 people a year were leaving Hong Kong. Now that number was correct for the worst year. I couldn't find any newspaper that reported that that year 80,000 people moved in. Hong Kong has always been a city of refugees coming in and moving on. And if the death of Hong Kong's story were valid, as we got closer to 1997, there should have been more people moving out, fewer people moving in. The reality was that the number moving out declined toward about 40,000, and the number moving in increased to about 120,000. Completely false story. The story about everybody moving to Singapore was particularly interesting. The numbers were classified in both Hong Kong and Singapore. But one year, Lee Kuan Yew gave a National Day speech and mentioned the number of Hong Kong people who had moved to Singapore over a period of 4 years. That number was under 40, 40. About 9 people a year. I got a senior Hong Kong official to leak to me the numbers of Singaporeans who had moved to Hong Kong. It was thousands of families. So Hong Kong had to build a Singapore International School, it's a big school, to accommodate all the Singaporeans moving to Hong Kong. Again, what Westerners learned about Hong Kong in this period was the exact opposite of the truth. After I published these numbers, which became well known in Hong Kong, but not internationally, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is my bank's regulator, we made $30 to $60 million a year in Singapore, so it was a big deal, made a tremendous effort to get me fired. They wrote and said, wrote to my chairman, "Why is your bank harboring this anti-Singapore economist?" After months of deliberation, my bank wrote back that it was difficult to fire an economist for publishing numbers that the Monetary Authority agreed were true. The Monetary Authority relented only when, in another National Day speech, Lee Kuan Yew quoted 2 people at length. One was Henry Kissinger, the other one was me. So all of a sudden I was okay. So what was going on here? Well, most newspapers didn't have bureaus in Hong Kong. So the reporters would fly in, they'd talk to Christopher Patton and Martin Lee, pick up some of the Singapore propaganda, and fly home and write what we came to call the standard 8-paragraph story on death of Hong Kong. And Patton and Martin Lee were human rights heroes, so you didn't have to check their facts and see if there was any balancing information. Newsweek did have an office in Hong Kong, and Dinda Elliott, who runs China File, they said, well, when we send our stories back about the booming economy, the editors in New York just change them. Anyway, so Hong Kong people were nervous about what China would do. They took out all kinds of insurance, but they were mostly happy to be rid of the British. Nearly everyone felt Chinese. In my first 16 years of living in Hong Kong, I only heard one person express any interest in independence, and that was Emily Lau, Hong Kong's least popular legislator, who now runs the Democrat Party. In the years after 1997, China scrupulously honored the promises of the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law. Most notably, but it implemented them in a very stingy rather than a generous way. And the most notable example of that was the promise of eventual universal suffrage. Now, universal suffrage just means everybody gets to vote. It doesn't say how the candidates to vote on are chosen. Could be anything from Western-style democracy to the Communist Party in Beijing designating somebody and saying, oh, okay, you can all vote for her. Beijing's interpretation in those days was much closer to the former than to the latter. Although there were continued expectations of liberalization on both sides, Chinese leaders were fearful and distrustful, and as leadership changed and people became less and less familiar with Hong Kong, they became more and more distrustful. And being stingy, they squandered much of the goodwill that they had in Hong Kong. In 2003, China chose new leaders. Hu Jintao had qualified himself for the top job by being very tough on Tibet, and he adopted a very tough stance on Hong Kong. The mood in Hong Kong became quite nervous. To my surprise, two thought leaders from Shanghai flew to Los Angeles, where I was then working at RAND, and they said, China's new leaders are mismanaging the relationship in Hong Kong. We don't know what to do. Can you help us? So I sat down with them and analyzed the new leaders' fears and how to assuage them. When the new leaders saw Hong Kong demonstrations, they thought Tiananmen Square. Show them no, they apply for permission, they walk where they said they would walk, and they go home. In those days, that's the way it worked. When they heard demands for democracy, oh, Taiwan, democracy means independence. Again, in all those years, I never heard a single person express an interest in independence, so they conveyed that. And they saw, like Washington, they saw, partly because Washington built him up, they saw Martin Lee as the face of democratic movement. He's fanatically anti-China. So I got out the polls. Their polls, would you trust this person to be leader of Hong Kong? Anson Chan used to get 68%, Tung Chee-hwa 57%. Martin Lee topped out at 11%. No, he's not the face of the democratic movement. So you don't need to worry. So, well, what should we do? Well, I suggested that one of the top leaders go down and resolve the fears that had arisen. They wrote me back from Shanghai and said, well, we couldn't get one of the senior leaders, but we got the United Front minister, a lady, to go down and talk to the Hong Kong politicians. And that worked remarkably well. But our leaders are very fearful about this big demonstration coming up on July 1st. What should we do about that? So I said, well, the leaders of that annual demonstration have really reached out to you because they're calling it a celebration of civil society, not a demonstration. So why don't you get one of the top 2 leaders to go down and keynote the celebration. And with Rand's permission, I even wrote a speech that such a leader should give in Hong Kong. So I sent that off, and a few days later they wrote, well, I couldn't get one of the top leaders, surprise, to keynote the event, but Vice President Zheng Qinghong flew down to Shenzhen and invited the Hong Kong political leaders to come over and talk to him. That really educated him. My Shanghai friends described him as a guy who had to make 300 decisions a day. It's a big country with a lot of issues, and he didn't know anything about Hong Kong. Well, now he knew. So things calmed down on both sides. I learned 2 things from this exercise. One was that although China's top leaders are the most experienced in the world by far, they get there by being successful at every level and on building roads, and building education systems, fixing environmental problems. Boy, are they experienced. The one thing they don't have any experience with about is Hong Kong. It makes them really nervous. Second thing I learned was that the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy had given Martin Lee its big democracy award. Statue of the Goddess of Liberty from Tiananmen Square. So just combining all the things, all of the issues in Chinese leaders' minds that tended to cause trouble for one country, 2 systems, potentially nullifying everything we were trying to do to make one country, 2 systems work. I reached some very strong conclusions with some relevance today. The National Endowment for Democracy is too small and too ideologically rigid to have much beneficial effect, but it's big enough to be a scapegoat and stupid enough to do damage. Since that time, there have been stresses and strains at the boundary of one country, 2 systems. There was an effort in 2003 to enact a required anti-subversion law. Hong Kongers were afraid of that, so they demonstrated. Beijing backed off. And then in 2012, they wanted to enact a patriotic education law, and again, Hong Kongers treasure their education system, so they demonstrated, centrally backed off. These were stresses and strains at the boundary of the system, but they were managed by flexibility on both sides. In 2014, expectations of electoral liberalization rose. People wanted something to happen in 2007, it didn't happen. In 2014, getting fairly antsy. China said, okay, we'll elect the chief executive by popular vote, but the candidates will be those that receive more than 50% endorsements from a committee of 1,200 carefully pro-Beijing folks selected by Beijing. And that effectively allowed China to choose the chief executive. More importantly, Beijing's misunderstanding and distrust of Hong Kong was beginning to have a mirror image effect in Hong Kong. People were becoming saying, well, you know, they don't like us, they don't trust us, they're not going to do anything for us. When I returned to Hong Kong in 2013, I was amazed to find a nascent nativist movement and a few supporters of independence. There have always been Cantonese nativist tendencies in Hong Kong. When I moved there in 1985, Shopkeepers were often very rude to people who spoke Putonghua. They were very nice to the Japanese, and they carefully studied Japanese because the Japanese had lots of money. Well, after a while, the Japanese faded, and all these rich people started coming down from China, so everybody started learning Putonghua and smiling once in a while. But in the early days, nouveau riche mainlanders often behaved like American tourists in the 1950s. You know, we had our shot at this. The Germans and Japanese were the bad guys for a while. Now it was China's turn. And tossing lots of McDonald's containers out of the window of the Mercedes 500 as it went down the street. And sometimes allowing their children to defecate on the street. That one became kind of the symbol. Unfairly, but these things happen. They crowded out local shoppers along the border. Smart college students from China humiliated the locals because they spoke really good Mandarin and really good English, and the locals didn't speak either one well. Often didn't do all that well in Cantonese. Very large mainland population moved in, and since the cultural balance is shifting, it also over time started to drive property prices to levels unattainable by most local people. Most Hong Kong people still feel overwhelmingly Chinese, but these re-emergent cultural tensions have started to radicalize a small group. Still, Hong Kong politics remain manageable. Decisive change started in 2015. In that year, China moved to shut down a group of book publishers and booksellers who thrived on publishing embarrassing stories about China's top leaders. That genre no longer exists. Freedom of the press ended for book publishers. Then Public Security Bureau officers showed up at Hong Kong's Four Seasons Hotel and spirited Xiao Jianhua, a businessman accused of very widespread corruption, back to China. So much for the promised reliance on Hong Kong's legal system. And then the Foreign Correspondents Club hosted a meeting where Joshua Wong, the Occupy movement leader, spoke. And they asked the local Financial Times editor to chair the meeting, which he did. The Hong Kong government refused to renew the FT editor's Hong Kong work visa. Decisively ended freedom of the press for journalists. In response to complaints that these decisions infringed China's promises, in 2017, Foreign Ministry spokesman Lu Kang said the joint declaration is a purely historical document that, quote, no longer has any practical significance, unquote. This is a historical watershed. My first paper in my career was a memo for Henry Kissinger on whether they could trust, if they did a deal on Nixon's visit to China about Taiwan, whether they could trust China to honor its promises. And I had to survey every kind of deal China had been involved in. And my conclusion was that China, if anything, was better at honoring its promises than the United States. That was true until the last few years. This is a big change. That treaty is still a treaty filed with the United Nations with no provision for withdrawal. It's almost as if they imported President Trump. But for Hong Kong, that's irrelevant because the basic law written for Hong Kong Chinese people by the Chinese government has exactly the same promises. Hong Kong residents shall have freedom of speech, of the press, and of publication, freedom of association, of assembly, of procession, and of demonstration. and the right and freedom to join trade unions and to strike. Article 22 is relevant for having the Public Security Bureau come down into Hong Kong and kidnap a guy and take him back. No department of the Central People's Government and no province, autonomous region, or municipality directly under the central government may interfere in the affairs which the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region legal system administers on its own in accordance with this law. There is no ambiguity in these laws as they apply to freedom of the press and autonomy of the Hong Kong legal system. The repudiation of the fundamental rules of one country, two systems created a buildup of frustration. People couldn't express the frustration when a visa isn't renewed or a guy is kidnapped. It's over. The extradition law had to pass through a legislative process, so there was time. So all these frustrations came out. It wasn't about the extradition law. It was about the repudiation of the core promises of one country, two systems. The ultimate repudiation of the promise of free speech is a demand that companies censor their employees' posts about Hong Kong or face destruction of their businesses. Started with Cathay Pacific, and then PwC, the accounting firm, and then the NBA. That demand, which affects not only companies based in Hong Kong, but also overseas companies, has the potential for a civilizational clash. Free speech is the core value of the Western world. And if continued attempts to export Chinese censorship will lead to massive business disruption and political tension. This is a big one. These are the demonstrations that were triggered. China's propaganda ministry has blamed the protests primarily on black hands supported by the US and Taiwan, which allegedly are paying the protesters. Their videos and media campaigns have been brilliant. I haven't seen anything that really comes close elsewhere. They say the protesters are paid. Well, take very deep pockets to pay all these people. And the legislators, when Carrie Lam tried to give a talk in the legislature, the elected legislators jostled her and wouldn't let her talk. Are those elected legislators being paid? Are only a few people are being paid? Is there some magic by which the CIA or Taiwan's equivalent can show a few people how to bring 1 million people onto the street? Or maybe it's just the violent protesters who are being paid. The violence has been really nasty. You've seen more pictures on TV. I don't need to show more. But if it's Americans who are paying them, what's the motive? I don't know any American who believes that this violence or seeking independence would be positive for Taiwan, for Hong Kong. It's a guarantee, if it continues and escalates, of the central government coming in and not having any democracy or any autonomy. So the political logic there is a little. And how about Tsai Ing-wen in Taiwan? Her policy has been tread very carefully, trying to keep her base pacified, but not to do anything that would provoke trouble with the mainland. Well, this would really provoke a lot of trouble with the mainland. So maybe somebody's paying some of these people, but ultimately all the conspiracy theories, and there are 4 big conspiracy theories, I won't go into in detail, come back to the fundamental problem of here's a huge proportion 1 million, sometimes allegedly 2 million people out of 7 million on the streets protesting peacefully. This is a whole society that's saying we need some changes. And even if, you know, a millionaire, a billionaire based in Taiwan is paying some of these people, you still have to come back to deal with this fundamental problem. Now, how do you resolve this problem? The most important problem that needs to be solved is Beijing's repudiation of its own promises. And the only way to handle that is to say some subordinates made some terrible mistakes, and we're really devoted to the promises we made in the Basic Law, and everything's going to work going forward. The second problem is a very fundamental flaw in the conception of one country, two systems. China has always seen Hong Kong as a business. So it doesn't have a mayor, it doesn't have a governor, it has a chief executive. And the chief executive is a business person, or in this case, a civil servant. They've had 2 business people and 2 civil servants with no political experience or skills. The decisions are to be made in Beijing the way the decisions used to be made in London. Now these people, very well-meaning, and they have no idea how to mobilize public support, how to mediate conflicts. They have no experience in fighting for their city's interests against pressures from above. Believe me, a Shanghai mayor or Shanghai party secretary feels his city's vital interests are being threatened. He pushes back. They have no idea how to reassure Beijing about Hong Kong or to reassure their own people that their interests will be protected. No mainland city would ever be governed by anyone with a total lack of political experience. You get political experience by elbowing your way up. It's a tough job, and you have to learn to handle that. But the whole conception of Hong Kong as a business is flawed. The third problem is the structure of the democracy movement. It's fragmented into very small, very competitive groups. Take the Democrat Party, which Washington happened to have focused on. It's essentially a tiny structure. Last time I checked, which was years ago, had fewer than 50 members, with a Leninist political structure. They have a political bureau. Emily Lau is particularly fervent about kicking out anybody who disagrees with her. And if you're Beijing and you want to do a deal, if one party signs on, the others are all going to say it's sold out. So you almost have to do incremental democratization from above. It would be nice if the Democratic parties would believe in democracy. Get together, have one big party, elect one leader, and then somebody could negotiate with them. The Hong Kong government makes this worse because when there are peaceful protests, they like to throw the leaders in jail. You need somebody to negotiate with. Even if you don't like people, you need them to have a leader. Zhang Jingguo in Taiwan was very smart about this. He kept the nascent DPP illegal, but encouraged them to organize, and then he could do a deal, and the deal would stick. Well, maybe too late for all that. A popular fatigue at the demonstrations and anger at the violence mean that the number of participants is declining fast. The level of violence remains high, but gradually people who throw petrol bombs will end up in jail. This is probably going to fade out. Without change of heart in Beijing, one country, two systems will persist, but only as a ghost of its former self. It will have an independent judiciary, but But people will always wonder, in an important case, will Beijing come in and pull people back to China? Faced with the requirement to censor their employees, many Western companies will leave Hong Kong. Ironically, in many cases, continuing what's already a vast exodus to Shanghai. There may be a considerable exodus of local Cantonese. These companies and families will be replaced by big companies and rich families moving down from China. Hong Kong will not collapse, but it will be quite different. Deng Xiaoping's hopes that Hong Kong, remember, the purpose is to reassure Taiwan, make reunification with Taiwan easily achievable. Those hopes are totally defeated. Hong Kong is now an equal and opposite source of determination in Taiwan never to accept reunification in any form. That leaves Beijing with only one option for reunification, and that's military force, if they can afford the terrible price. Those of us who spend a little time working on military issues remember that when MacArthur was island hopping in World War II up from Australia, he got to the Philippines, and then his aides said, "Taiwan's next, right?" MacArthur said, "No, too tough. Go jump over to Okinawa." That's not a happy story. I hope there's a happier ending, but I'll end there. Hope I've offended everybody. Thank you very much.